I am the next speaker. I'm not going to go into an extensive introduction of myself, but I've been Herald Chair of Fine Arts in the University of Melbourne for 17 years, and I'm currently the Foundation Director of the Australian Institute of Art History. And we recently had the pleasure of having Gerard Vaughan as a professorial fellow in Melbourne, and it's an institute that we published recently, a little booklet, a little brochure about our first 5 years. And we're, at the end, we put Ramsay on the cover of that because, of course, it's a Ramsay moment, you might say, within the history of Melbourne. My paper is about Joseph Burke, the first Herald Chair of Fine Arts in the University of Melbourne, and his relationship with Ramsay. Of course, he didn't know him. It's a posthumous relationship, but an important point, I think, in the critical reception of Ramsay. Joseph Burke was one of the first graduates of the Courtauld Institute of Art, and he was appointed as the first Herald Chair of Fine Arts in the University of Melbourne in 1946 at the age of 33. They don't usually appoint professors anymore at such a tender young age. He was an excellent scholar with a specialist interest in 18th century English art, especially Hogarth. But he has also had a diplomatic career, which is very unusual for an art historian. At the outbreak of the Second World War, he was seconded from the Victoria and Albert Museum to the Home Office in 1939, and he was a success in this political appointment and became private secretary to a succession of Lord Presidents of the Council and finally to the Prime Minister Clement Attlee, and he was secretary to Attlee from 1945 to 1947, and the negotiations for him to become the first professor of art history in Melbourne went on during those 2 years. The Herald, and you can see him here in this, he always wore this amazing pinstripe suit, rather nonchalantly. He was sort of Anglo-Irish, so he was rather sort of jokey with English traditions, and he was extraordinarily witty and funny. He was the sort of person, if he took you out to dinner, you were crying with laughter at the anecdotes that he would tell. He had an extraordinarily infectious and charming personality, and both Patricia and I were students of Joe Burke and remember him, I think, very fondly. The idea of having a Herald Chair, which remains a rather unique title in Australia, was conceived by Darrell Lindsay, then director of the National Gallery of Victoria, and whom you heard about from Gerard, and he managed to persuade Keith Murdoch to make a magnificent gift in order to create the resources to educate curators for the new museums in Australia. Joe, as we came to know him, came highly recommended by his good friend, Kenneth Clark. Here we have an image, of course, of Clark and another picture of Joe Burke in 1947, just after he'd arrived in Australia. Some of the infectious, handsome, charming nature of his personality comes through in this photograph. Kenneth Clark wrote to Medley, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, and said, "I think he would be an excellent appointment. He's a serious and well-trained student of art history with a real grasp of essentials. Although he's made a profound study of Hogarth and 18th century art theory, he is not limited to this period and has that genuine appreciation of modern art without which knowledge of the art of the past becomes rather dead. He also has great enthusiasm, which I'm sure is one of the chief assets in a post of this kind, especially where a study of art history is not a well-established tradition. If he goes to Australia, he will be much missed in the country where he is generally regarded as one of the most promising art scholars of his generation." Now that's a sort of, Ken Clark had this amazing ability to summarize and put together the essentials of a person's or of a painting's nature. In another letter, Clark wrote that the positions he has held during the war have given him an ease and confidence in dealing with people, which are rather rare among scholars. and that, again, is one of those very succinct ways of defining Joe. And of course, he lived up to Clark's reputation. They seem to have been quite close friends from the correspondence that survives. And Clark didn't have a lot of friends, so this is a kind of interesting friendship, I think. His British colleagues kept a post open for Joe at the V&A for 3 years after he came to Melbourne, should he have changed his mind about Australia. When he first arrived, Joe wished to establish a canon of Australian art history. There was very little published on the subject. Bernard Smith's Place, Taste and Tradition had just appeared in 1945, and was shortly preceded by William Moore's The Story of Australian Art. Neither, of course, discuss Ramsay. The extensive archives of Joe Burke's papers that we have at the University of Melbourne, and they are very extensive, he left them, he obviously wanted to be studied, contain many speeches given at the openings of contemporary art exhibitions, of the lunches he held for artists to meet visitors from abroad, such as when he introduced Sidney Nolan to Kenneth Clark. And they testify to his great enthusiasm for Australian contemporary painting. Burke was keen on publishing Australian periodicals and on creating an Australian collection for the University of Melbourne. Among his favourites were Tas Drysdale, whom he had quite a good friendship with, and Hugh Ramsay. Among Burke's papers are notes for a lecture on Ramsay in 1947, only a year after he arrived in Australia. So he must have been immediately struck by Ramsay's works. Darrell Lindsay's exhibition was in 1943 and predated his arrival in Australia, but Joe got along very well with Darrell Lindsay, and probably the permanent display at the National Gallery of Victoria was where Joe first encountered Ramsay's works. But he was quite fascinated by him. Lindsay's retrospective exhibition of Ramsay's work in 1943 had an enormous impact on people, and perhaps he was spoken to about this. And especially the enthusiastic reviews of Baldwin Spencer. I didn't realize he opened the exhibition until I heard Gerard mention that in his paper. Though he's best known for his work on Indigenous art, Baldwin Spencer was an energetic trustee of the National Gallery of Victoria, collected contemporary Australian painting, and was quite a mover and shaker in what you might call whitefella art, not only in Indigenous things. In 1949, Joe Burke wrote to Lady Ramsay, the sister-in-law of the painter, to state his intention to write a book on Ramsay and to see the paintings in her possession at her home, Raglan, in Launceston. Ramsay is, he wrote, in my opinion, one of the most distinguished of Australian painters and has not yet had the overseas recognition that he deserves. After his visit, he wrote to Lady Ramsay to thank her. I am sending herewith 2 of the photographs of the drawings which I so shamelessly stole from you during my second memorable visit to your hospitable house. The others photographed equally as well and will make splendid illustrations to the little book on which I'm working. After a very delayed start, the latter is at last forging ahead. The transcript of Hugh Ramsay's letters is well underway, and after I have obtained some more photographs and collected some further material for the introduction, the back of the work will be broken. I've mentioned to the Vice-Chancellor your extremely generous offer to present these drawings to the University of Melbourne. The book on Ramsay will in fact be the first one on an Australian artist published by the University of Melbourne Press, and this is one of the many reasons why to have the drawings would mean a great deal to us here. Not least, we are trying to build the main centre in Australia for the study of Australian art. On the 19th of June 1952, Joe wrote again to Lady Ramsay about his publishing plans. There has recently been lent to the university an important collection of Hugh Ramsay's letters. These are the ones that are now in the NGA. Particularly those written from Paris. These throw valuable light not only on his own art, but on the experiences of an Australian student of great distinction during his studies overseas. It is proposed to publish the letters together with reproductions of the best drawings and paintings. I should like to write a short introduction of this, incorporating comments on Ramsay written by those who knew him. Now, I can't find in the voluminous papers of Joe Burke any writing at all on Ramsay, apart from the correspondence and this amazing notebook that I showed you at the beginning of my lecture. When I was researching on Joe Burke's papers for a lecture I gave in 2002, without knowing of Burke's letters to Ramsay, I discovered this little Winsor & Newton sketchbook among his papers, and I thought it was Ramsay, so I immediately called Trish, and she came in and said, yes, she immediately identified that it was one of the, had been a book that he had kept on a voyage to Europe on the SS Persic, where he met Lambert. And she was a little bit severe with me and said to me, well, there are better drawings, Janie, to discuss, not the ones in the University of Melbourne. But as Joe had really wanted to do a book on these drawings and the letters, I thought that it was perhaps more important. He also interviewed George Bell, J.S. MacDonald, as well as Lady Ramsay, but I can find no trace of these interviews in the papers, which is rather a pity. Burke came to art history from literary studies, and it's revealing that his most important work was a critical study of Hogarth's writings. He had an innate preference for works on paper, and it's not hard to understand why he liked Ramsay's letters, which are particularly vivacious, with animated cartoon-like drawings, often providing a humorous commentary on the text. For example, this example from Paris, written to his sister Jessie, where he compliments her on getting a whole lot of prizes, and there's a little caricature of her carrying a very big load of prizes and a wheelbarrow behind. And then there's himself in bed in Paris, and so on and so forth. So these drawings are really quite delightful. And they've never really been, Tricia has used very important quotations from them in her book, but they've never really been published in their entirety. And it would be rather nice to do something, I think, on the drawings and the letters. My dear, yes, the notebook that Lady Ramsay gave to the University of Melbourne is now in the archives, and it was an account, it was quite clearly done on the voyage of the SS Persic, and this was what he went to Europe on. It was a long trip from that left Melbourne in September 1900 and arrived in England in November, and all sorts of dramatic events happened on board. The best account is given in Amy Lambert's book, The Career of Lambert, 30 Years of an Artist's Life, which has several pages about what must have been her honeymoon. Because she married 2 days before she got on this boat. And it's impossible, she wrote, to overrate the value to both George Lambert and Hugh Ramsay of this voyage companionship. It was long and arduous. The liner was inexpensive as it was carrying a huge cargo of frozen meat to the soldiers who had participated in the Boer War. According to Amy Lambert, Hugh Ramsay had a large cabin which he used as a studio, and he worked on the picture Consolation that Tricia showed on board the ship. And I have asked Tricia what else he did on board the boat, but we haven't been able to work that out yet, apart from the drawing book. But we know from Amy Lambert he had this large studio and worked all the time. The sketchbook contains some loose sheets from other sketchbooks, and this is a previously unknown self-portrait in a jacket and tie that is a very compelling picture. And there is a further self-portrait in the book itself. He wasn't kind to himself sometimes, as Patricia pointed out. Other loose sheets contain images of Clydebank, his family home. It's on yellowish paper, and it suggests that he popped it into this book and took it with him as a memory of a house that he loved. And there's a little drawing of a gate on the fence on the other side. The sketchbook has many drawings of seated people in deck chairs. And it might be interesting to try and find the passenger list of the SS Persic and try and identify them. I tried to find, unsuccessfully, pictures of the Lamberts. And I asked Anna Gray, who is the great Lambert expert, and she said that I thought this man with this characteristically flamboyant moustache might have been a good candidate for George Lambert. But actually, Anna tells me he didn't have a moustache at this period. So, so that was rather a blow, and I don't think this could be him either, but I'd rather hoped to identify him. Also, Amy Lambert was apparently drawn by him and painted by him on the boat, and I looked in vain in the sketchbook for Amy Lambert, but unfortunately, Anna said she had a much rounder face and a different hairstyle at that period. So I don't quite know who this person is, but it shows you what it looked like. There are lots of pictures, portrait drawings of people who are quite individual personalities, and I don't really know who they are. This looks like a sailor or a soldier. And there are coastline drawings of the Cape of Good Hope. They arrived just after the Boer War had ended, and apparently it was all rather dirty and horrible. And anyway, you don't see this from the drawings, just see the coastline and the things underneath. And then there are sketches of hands and this sort of thing. In all, there are about 120 new images of Ramsay's work in this little sketchbook. The only incident that's really recognizable from the description in Amy's book is the SS Madura, a vessel whose cargo of roofing felt had burst into flames in mid-ocean and had added to the list of unexpected passengers, and the conditions on the boat grew more intolerable. So this fire on this boat seems perhaps to be the SS Madura. Now, we've heard quite a little bit about Paris, and we've seen what Ramsay painted in Paris, but I thought it might be interesting to look at just the atmosphere. Judging by the letters, he had a quite simple existence in Australia, in the sense that it wasn't sophisticated socially, but he preferred Paris to London, who doesn't? And he loved the politics of the salon. And here is a salon painter of about the same period, with a whole host of people, some of whom, like Bouguereau, who he described as an old man and not very interesting in one of the letters, judging the paintings. Of all the letters that Ramsay wrote, one addressed to Bernard Hall, his teacher at the gallery school, is the most significant in terms of understanding his career as an artist and his reaction to what he saw in Europe. The letter is also in the National Gallery of Australia among the Bernard Hall papers, and you can see he was very charming with his siblings in the letters that he wrote to his family, but this is a very serious letter that he wrote on the 19th of June 1902 from Abbey Court in St John's Wood, where he was staying with Longstaff. At the beginning of the letter, he states a clear preference to Paris. I'd soon be back in good old Paris, grubbing along and doing as I pleased. You don't realise what a place is to you until you leave it, and that certainly applies to Paris, doesn't it? I think the average standard of the salons is very much higher than that of the Academy, but for the show of old masters from private collections which are constantly being held in London, England is so much richer in that respect than any other country. To come back to England's wealth in old masters, out of 240 Velasquez in existence, 40 are in England. Paris is fine for one-man shows. I love that judgment on England and Velasquez. I think that's quite revealing. And right throughout the pictures we've seen this morning, there's himself looking like Velasquez in a self-portrait next to a painting that was of Las Meninas and things like that. And he goes on, the old salon is the tremendous show it always is, but very fine things are conspicuous by their absence. There are lots of huge canvases, which are fine, and achievements of workmanship from a vulgar point of view, but that's all one can say of them. The old men are mostly disappointing. M. Bouguereau, for example, is as sweet as ever. Jean-Paul Laurens is a striking exception. He shows a fine picture of the proclamation of the Republic, or something low, rich in tone, splendid in composition, as he always is, free and masterful in actual workmanship. It looks like a sketch for a very big thing. Laurens has some stunning designs of enormous size, which ought to look fine when mellowed with age. Bonnard, Henner, and others of the big men show signs of falling off. He was always very cheeky in his, and confident in his judgment of other artists. Bonnard's portraits to me are loathsome now. The show on the whole is consistently cold, correctly classical or artificially so. There's a want of personality, of strong individuality. It shows the iron, unswerving heel of the traditions and conventionalities of the centuries. The spirit of the new salon, where he had such a conspicuous success, which Patricia described, is much finer. The work isn't so consistent as that of the old, inasmuch as the result is often a failure, but they try the intention is good, and it's a good failure. I don't mean that you're shocked by bad drawing and construction and things like that, as in the new. Those qualities are as good as the old. The school of Paris won't allow that. In the new, you see much more youth, vigour and personality. The results all show a sincere try to get away from the conventions laid down by rule and to get something finer. Sargent shows 3 pictures. 2 are perfectly stunning. He gives you a bit of well-selected nature, as she actually is to him, all the beauty of silver, light on colour, an atmospheric environment, and existence of life. The pictures give you that shock of contact with life. Lucien Simon, to me the most personal of modern French artists, shows some splendid things. His brushwork is not so harsh and choppy, and his work is altogether more refined than before. This is a rather long quotation, but I think it testifies to the value of these letters. And this one to Hall is particularly important. And he's looking not just at Velasquez, but he's looking at other artists at a whole contemporary overview. And he quite clearly prefers the young, vigorous things. We put on our brochure of the first 5 years of the Australian Institute of Art History one of the most sensual paintings that Ramsay ever did. It's hard to, it's in the University of Melbourne collections. We have some wonderful pictures by Ramsay, and it's one of those pictures that is haunting. Gerard talked about Ramsay being a painter's painter, and it's hard to define the sensuality and the restrictive nature of his palette, but he is really quite a star in this way. Now, why was Joe Burke so fascinated by him? Well, Joe loved figurative painting. He loved the drawings, and he loved the letters that he had written in which he testifies in those things to Lady Ramsay. And he had a very particular and individual taste. It wasn't just that Darrell Lindsay told him this was a painter to look at or something like that. He really, really did warm and appreciate Ramsay. It's a pity that he never did the book, but we will make good that. And I know that Kelly Gallatley is here today, and that the Potter Museum is thinking of doing an exhibition of Ramsay. And so we hope that some of the research that will be coming out today will be put in that catalogue or in a book beforehand, if possible. Joe Burke occupied one of the first named chairs in Australian universities. And I think he would be terribly proud of the fact that the second named chair in the University of Melbourne was going to be dedicated to Hugh Ramsay, an artist whom he loved and admired. And even though he didn't write the book, he was going to write lots of books that he didn't write. He certainly did a lot to encourage Hugh Ramsay's reputation. So thank you, Patricia.